Good morning to all of you being here and to all those online for joining for the biodiversity seminar. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Pedro Tognetti today. He's a professor at the University of Buenos Aires, working in the agronomy department and teaching as well a lot of statistics. And he's here today because he's a WSL fellow for 1 year. He came in July and will stay here till next June. So he will be around for quite a bit. So you will see him and he will be happy to chat with you or whatever, help you out with statistics or just with general science, and just happy to chat. Today he will talk about his research in the pampas, which are very flat. So it's quite a change from our mountainous systems to the flatlands of Argentina. So please go ahead, Pedro.
Okay, thank you, Anita, for the introduction, and thank you very much for being here. And I hope thousands of people are online. So for me, it's a great pleasure to talk about our system, the Pampas. What I will present is just a few parts of my work and a long history of research in the area. So as Anita said, I'll try to move from this mountain landscape of in Switzerland. This is the Valmuster near the national park in the east part of Switzerland, and this is our system invaded by a couple of researchers from Australia and Switzerland. Anita and Martin go there for some time because we work together in the nutrient network. There is a coordinated group of researchers that do nice research on grasslands. So I try to move you up down to the pampas that, as you say, is a flat landscape. At some point, one guy in the 60s do the other way around. So this is Rolando León. This was my advisor the degree, so it's an honor thesis, you call it here, when I was studying agronomy, and he worked in the ETH in the 60s with Ellenberg. And at that point, he worked in the same landscape that we are visiting now. So this is Lake Zurich, and this is the wet tilber, and he do grassland ecology in the 60s at this point, trying to understand the balance of nitrogen and water in these grasslands. So at some point, he moved back to Argentina, and I think that he brought three main tools. One was take from Montpellier school, that is this kind, I don't know if you know it, try to understand the ecosystem in a hierarchical way. So try to understand how the patterns that we see in one level are explained by mechanism at the lower level and by the context at the upper level. This works for every level of heterogeneity you want to understand. The second was a pleasure or a incredible love for plants. This is a native grass in Argentina. There is a Panicum gowini, and apart from a plant, this species has a lot of stories to tell. So this way of presenting a plant in a human with a story, with a tale, make us very happy learning plants. And the third tool he brought from Switzerland was the methods, so the analysis of the vegetation. Probably it was an old school method at some point, but there was how biodiversity was studied at that point. And at some point, we are still having better methodological approach, but the background is the same. So he moves the system from this. This is two artists from Argentina. That is on the left side is Pruneliano Porredón painting the landscape of the Pampa in the end of the 19th century. And this is Molina Campos, that was a cartoon painter. And Rolando moved the system from this to this. That is almost the same. There's not much change. So what I try to do today is to introduce and get it a little bit deeper in the Pampas, try to understand how biodiversity is organized, what are the problems that we are having with biodiversity now in the region, and what are the restoration pathways or the approach that we have. In other words, is how many pampas do we have, and how they change with the level of observation. how to balance nature and production, and what we do between rangers as or ecologists in this system. These are Pampas region, so it's mixed between the Campos, that is the south part of Uruguay and Brazil, and the Pampas region. While this was an old massive stone block, this was a field area of an old estuary. So it was filled with, in the Quaternary, with loess from the Andean. When the Andes go up, they was filled. So it's a kind of new system. And these Pampas and the Campos called is Rio de la Plata grassland. Altogether, a grassland that contain almost 5,000 species. These 5,000 species are split between the three countries. And among these species, we have almost 10% of species that only are in these grasslands, endemic species, and almost between 5 and 25% of exotic species. So it's a mix of original species of the region and new species coming. So the Pampas are divided in several sub-regions, and this is what I will start with the first one, that is the Rolling Pampa. Oh yeah. This is the Rolling Pampa. It's called rolling because this Pampa has a drainage system. So because there is has the effect of rain, they have fluxes on rivers and slopes and valleys in a very particular way that make the landscape not that flat. And these grasslands are characterized by a lot of species of stipas, botricloas, and the stipas they can change to nacella. In the other part, this it was a dry area, so there's a big water gradient from the east to the west. So this Pampa was filled with coarser grain minerals, and these coarser grain minerals produced that there's more sandy soils. And on this soil, you have these aeolian landscapes that is not modulated by water, but yet for the wind, and quite different landscape. Between these two grasslands, we can imagine that we can have a big gradient of heterogeneity in diversity. So at some point, these guys, Silvia Burkar and Rolando León, make a big assessment of how composition changed in this 600 kilometers gradient. So not to be much detail on the name of the species, but as you see, you have two main points. First, the point diversity, so how many species do you have in one census? That is one of these column of points, and the change in composition in the gradient. So it is clearly a gradient from slow changes in composition of species from one side to the other. And main drivers of these changes are, of course, you can imagine, is the texture of the soil. So in this area, you have more sandy soils and more thermal amplitude and more mean annual precipitation of warm mean annual precipitation, or the precipitation in the warm season, and more clayly fine coarser soils. So this big environmental gradient produce changes very slow in composition along this 700 kilometers point. So we now can move to the south. This is a different landscape, of course, because as I told you, you have a big estuary, and this was covered by loess, but some old rocks remained in the landscape. So these are all very old stone that generate a rocky system in the south of the Pampa and produce some kind of heterogeneity. These areas rich in cool season species. And then we go to the flat Pampa. That is the picture that I show you first, and that was one of our main study system. This landscape is completely flat. It's less than 0.1% of slope in this area. So in this Google capture, you have here the scale. So in this one, this is almost, so the circle is probably 3 kilometers wide. So in these 3 kilometers, you may have less than 5 meters or maybe 2 meters of slope. And you see some kind of heterogeneity here produced by probably coarse agricultural area and areas more marked by small river with meandric ways. If you close up, we start to see a fine-grained heterogeneity. So this fine-grained heterogeneity is in probably 20 meters, you have at least 4 things: black things, gray things, and green things, and probably something in between. So this is the heterogeneity at the scale that we see. And if you, if you see this in detail, this was should be there, and this is the detail. Okay, sorry, this was this. So this is the picture that I showed you recently, and if you see it, you see in less than 20 meters, so it's probably two times the size of this room. High points that are those full of thistles, and slow points. If you see here, you have small canalicles with water all the year, these dry areas, and you can have high position with tussock grasses. So sorry for putting this. At some point, Susanna Perelman and colleagues trying to explain this at the regional scale. So this photo I took was just in the middle of this M, that is Magdalena, this is our study sites. Castelli is another one, Ayacucho and La Prida. So between the 60s, when Rolando came from Switzerland, to the early 80s, they made near 800 releves in all this area, trying to understand how this biodiversity of the pattern of vegetation was organized in the area. And they found this. So if you take a look, you have the regions marked with small symbols. Magdalena, Castelli, Ayacucho, y La Prida are the 4. And if you have a look, you have these sites together organizing these vegetation units, and at the same time you have the sites spread along big gradients. So looks like heterogeneity is organized at some point. You have inside one of these sites all the possible points, and between the sites all the possible vegetation too. And the main drivers of this possible heterogeneity was fluid frequency, how frequency the lands are with water, and soil alkalinity or salinity, how bad are the soil. So you come here from high positions, well-drained organic soils to wet soils in this side with very low infiltration and with salinity or alkalinity in these 2 communities. This is interesting because it looks like you may have the same drivers of composition heterogeneity in all these sites that is 300 kilometers wide. This is how we see it. And this is important because this heterogeneity we see in this position, so this is allomorphic, so this is probably pH in the soil, is driving the relative cover of C3 and C4 species. So looks like this driver in the soil may change from probably 25 to less than 10% of C3 or C4 species in the soil. On the other hand, if we take just the third axis of the ordination, shows the third possible driver of heterogeneity is the latitude position. So in this ordination, you have the third axis that explains 20%, and you have Magdalena first, all the side of Magdalena, Castelli second, Ayacucho, and Lake La Prida. So the third driver after soil and salinity are the latitude. So if you say what's happening with latitude with the same group of species, you see that, okay, there are changes. So as far as you go south, you have less C4 species and you have more C3 species, so from warmer to cooler. But these changes is far less important than the changes in the small scale produced by pH. So looks like hydromorphism and salinity in the soil make changes, but not only on the organization of communities in landscape, but also on the local or point diversity. So this is species richness, and this is the topographic position. And these are the vegetation units that we have in the ordination, and this is the number of subgroup of these units. So that are these numbers. So more rich communities are those organized in the upper positions, and less rich communities are or low position or salinity. But the good thing is you see 4, 5, 6, 8, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So the allomorphic are here and the not allomorphic are here. So also pH is changing the richness in the community. So not only organize the beta diversity of organization of the communities in landscape, but also the local or point community diversity. Pardon. And is also related to the abundance of richness of exotic and native species. So this is again ordering the position of the type of communities, and this is how many species in terms of native black and exotic in white. And you see, as far as you go to more mild systems, you have more exotic species. So exotic species are copying the drivers of diversity of natives. So there are more diversity of native and exotic in lower and upper position, copying, presented like environmental filter through this community organization. After landscape heterogeneity and after local position of the system, there are contexts that make change the diversity of the system. So one is flooding or grazing that change the diversity of communities. If you have a look on grazing, for example, grazing is a force that may produce homogenization of communities. This is not probably very new in the system. So if you have grazing systems are similar in this ordination space, and if you exclude these systems are different. So at some point, the possibility of some species to establish or in this system, or some species to disappear in these systems are driving heterogeneity with grazing. And if you have a look on the flooding, that is another rabbit, this interact with grazing. So this is a kind of particular figure. So here we have a exponential diversity index. So it is more diverse and this is less diverse. And here we have the sample length. So samples of 5 meters, 10 meters, 15 meters, or 20 meters. And so the slope of these curves are a way of presenting beta diversity, so heterogeneity in the landscape. So in gray system, what we see is that post-flooding increased diversity. So, but this increase is similar for different, and doesn't change, increased diversity, but doesn't change the heterogeneity of the system. So only increase point diversity. However, it's different when you have ungrazed system that was very diverse in terms of heterogeneity, so that you have more species as you increase in area of sampling, and flooding reduced that spatial heterogeneity, maintaining local diversity. So at some point, what is happening is that as far as you have more rainfall, that is rainfall accumulation is a synonym of flooding, you have changes in plant cover. So grasses doesn't respond too much to this change in flooding, but forests that are mostly exotic species not adapted to these conditions decay in cover. So at some point, the pattern that we observe with grazing and with flooding on the change in diverse are expressed by the capacity of some species to adjust to flooding conditions at a very small scale. So this is a presentation of the first approach of biodiversity in in the pampas. So at some point, someone was so bored that tried to put some emotion on some strange thing in the pampas. And this is one architect that is called Salamone, that this is an entrance in a cemetery. And he made several other things in the landscape that try to break this homogeneity. So apart from diversity in plants, I'm not very special, but also this grassland support a lot of insect diversity, and this is an Asclepias with one of these flies and several vertebrate animals. When Anita Martin went to the Pampas for a workshop, they have a checklist and try to fix all the things that they found in the middle. And I think that they check most of them. So at some point we have to balance this system between nature and production. So it's the first step in the talk. So at the very beginning of the this was a paper from the 60s from Heinrich Walter. So I cannot even pronounce that, but he was worried about why trees were absent in the pampas. So this was a problem that was already very early in the story of ecology, with why pampas was a grassland without trees, and if this was culturally or naturally induced. Another point that was the problem in the early 20th century and the mid of the 20th century, that was the problem for the pampas and the ecologists. But I think that now I won't focus on this problem of tree invasion. That can be a topic for another talk. This is Gledicia triacanthus that is invading pampas all along the region. But I will focus on two other problems, that is the land use change and species invasion that may threaten conservation of biodiversity. So those are the current problems that we are having: the introduction of exotic species, changing in land use, and the balance between native and exotic grazers in the system, use the fire, and the use of nitrogen of fertilization in the system. And this is a probably old paper, but show how it changed the structure of the landscape in the last 20 years. So these are all the Pampas and Campos region, and shows the balance between water bodies, grassland, forest, and cropland. So the reddish, this is the Rolling Pampa that is well used for cropping, flooding Pampa, and this limit is quite strict. As I show you, this water limitation or this water imprint in the system is what produced the lack of entrance of crops in the system. However, in the last years, there was a big change in land use in the system. So this is how many grassland percentage was in the 80s and 90s, and this is the early 2000 years. So there was a big change, and this change occurred in all the grasslands. So in Brazil, for example, is the gray. There are some areas that were back to grassland system, but most of the Argentinian sites changed from grassland to other things. And this occurs in several regions. So this is our grassland from the south of Buenos Aires, our Paspalum quadriforme grassland. There are very big tussock grasslands that are a C4 species, but on the top of this tussock grassland, you have several different communities organized in different ways. Even you have always the same cover of species, you have a big heterogeneity below. So this grassland changed a lot between, this is a picture from the 70s, and this is a picture from the 2015. So it's a change not only in the change from agriculture, from grassland to agriculture, but also the change within grassland. So it's an intensification of grassland use. Probably this the step of changing from with the use of fire to reduce the cover and produce more forage for the species, and then after several years, if possible, put a crop on top of this. So this is just one problem, and the other is the invasion of exotic species. What is interesting in this system is that this is the relative cover, and black are native and wild are exotics, and this is a species rank. You don't have native dominants and exotic rare. You have all the combination of dominant, subordinate, and rare species as native and exotic. In fact, you have early successional species and late successional species of all components. So you have the opportunity, you have different niches occupied by this group of species in all the grassland. And at some point, they may affect diversity of the system, and this is a way to show it. So this is an ordination of grazed and ungrazed grasslands in the from 90s to the 2000s. So this is time in this axis, and this is grazing and ungrazing in this axis. So it's a clear effect of grazing, but at some point there is a trend in changing community with time. If you put the name of species, you have this. So you have here forbs, mostly exotic, that has the underline. And here you have native grasses. So at the very beginning, you have a chain from forbs to native grasses when you change from grazing to ungrazed. That's something that I already showed. But in the late years, you don't have such a change. The change is smaller, and it involves the cover of tall fescue. So tall fescue is a European Mediterranean species that respond to grazing. So in this engrazed tall fescue biomass in engrazed area are much higher than engrazed areas. So grazing is taking some kind of control of this grass. And even though, apart from grazing, you have the possible effect of fertilization. Fertilization enhance the abundance of these species in these grasslands. So this is the management that farmers, the rangers can do on these grasslands is important, and may induce the invasion of exotic species. So at some point, we have the idea of trying to understand how management affect community structure, and this affect richness and diversity at some point. And in this grassland, we observe that nutrient addition, excluding grazing or adding nutrients and excluding grazing affect community structure. So these are exotic species in dotted lines and native species in continuous lines. And this nutrient addition and excluding promote exotic forb and exotic grasses and promote tall fescue. And this effect from management go to the abundance of exotics and are correlated negatively with native abundance. And this finally determine a decrease in richness, mainly driven by the abundance of fescue. But apart from the effect induced by exclusion, nutrient addition has a direct effect on plant richness. So this is not new, but it's important to separate the possible effect of the invasion and the nutrient addition. So this is a paper that Ceci Molina presented last year. So this is the probability of species loss, and this is the initial abundance of a species. And each line represents how many nutrients do you add. So 3 nutrients is like adding N, P, and K. 2 nutrients is an N on P or P on K, or combination of 2 nutrients. 1 nutrient is adding just N or P of phosphorus of potassium. So in intact grasslands, as far as you add nutrients, you increase the probability of a species. So you reduce biodiversity by reducing the niche of species or the environmental niche. And the same occurs, but at a different level, when you mow. So it's clear that adding more nutrients may reduce diversity by increasing probability, the probability of losing species, but also that occurs in mowing plots. So it's not driven by light, but also driven by the reduction in the niche space of species. So this not only affects the point diversity, but also the heterogeneity. So this is beta diversity of intact and mowed plots. And now the number of nutrients are the x-axis, so no nutrients, 1, 2, or 3 nutrients added. And as far as you increase the number of nutrients, you reduce or you homogenize the grassland. This occurs in intact grassland, and in mowing, this effect only is seen when you increase the time. So this is the first year, the second, the third, and the fourth year. So as far as time goes down, you have more heterogeneous community. So these are kind of the impact that we are exploring with changes in rain, drought, change in landscape use, and invasion of exotic species and grazing effect on these grasslands. And now, finally, I want to shortly present some of the ways that we are trying to protect and conserve these grasslands. So one of the first efforts was, we can call it top-down or bottom-up. So if there is government driven or individually driven. So the first approach was bottom-up at some point. It was not the first, but it's a good description of, it's a nice book about what are the valuable lands. So áreas valiosas pastizales, valuable grassland areas. So in all the region, different spots where grassland were nicely conserved. And we work in some of them in the province, and we have colleagues in Uruguay and Brazil that have similar approaches. From the top down, this is the structure of the national parks in Argentina. And all the country has 27 national parks, and these three are mainly established in the Pampa region, that is a savanna park, a palm savanna park. Wetlands, Ciervo de los Pantanos is the swamps deer. And this is Campos del Tuyú is an other native deer that lives in these coastal grasslands. Of course, all these herbivores were the native deers, not the exotics, and were originally probably cover more space in the area, and now just restricted to this area. But it's important that most of this grassland has an animal, not a grassland to protect. So it's mostly driven by vertebrate conservation. And the third and more interesting approach is how rangers are aware of this problem and try to conserve this grassland. So this is Alianza de Pastizal, is like a grassland alliance. And it's a group of rangers from Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay that want to conserve this grassland and produce a meat that is based on environmentally friendly production. So this is the network of this approach, and was really supported again for bird conservation agencies. And the other approach is a civil approach. So this is an ugly photo of part of the nearest outskirts of Buenos Aires. And this is one big wetland in the middle of the urban area of Loma Zamora, where I born. So I born like here. And this is an approach that neighbors try to conserve these grasslands. So they use, I don't know how to call it because you don't have those here. They are like a piece of land not used and not, and probably you see fire because they drop garbage there and they put fire, and so they like unused area, but they try to, a lot of non-governmental organizations trying to conduct the conservation of the grasslands in these areas. So I surely tell you what we are doing as a scientist to help this, to restore these grasslands. So Pamela Graf is a colleague in the team, and the first idea, okay, if grazing is an important area, just try to reproduce grazing. And this is the cover of the invasive tall fescue in time, and this is a graze, is a line that I already showed you. The intact is a line that I already showed you with, if no grazing, there is a lot of tall fescue, and mowing may help to reduce tall fescue abandon. This is not very, not very new, but the point is, of course, absolute cover of native species increase, this is good. But the point is that we don't have all the species together. So one point is to see what happened with the recovery of native species, and then to see how cool or warm season species recover. So as far in the Cecilia submit a paper that trying to understand, so this is a control, this is selective clipping, not selective clipping, and selective clipping on Tolfequio, showing that if you dissolve, some groups doesn't appear anymore. But yes, the summer grasses. And she showed that adding species of cool season grasses, of course, promote this the abundance of the group, but nothing happened to the abundance of summer grasses. So this is partially explaining by the fact that we have a very particular system with a cyclic cover of summer grasses that have summer vegetation time, winter grasses that have different dynamic in the year, and Tolfequio coincide with the cover of winter grasses. So it's at some point is apart from the local effect of competition on native grasses, Tolfequio already may have affect the seed pool and limit the recovery of this grassland in terms of functional group abundance. So this is the main thing that I want to tell you. I hope you enjoyed the short history of Pampa grasslands. Of course, each of these figures has a lot of work and has a lot of branches that I can discuss with you. And we did this with a big group. This is Rolando several years ago, still working until his last days when he was 84. And this is our team in Laura and the colleagues. Enrique was my advisor and main of from the most of these researchers have been supported by him. And of course, I let you go back to from the flat pampas to the Alps. And I thank you very much for your attention. And I'm happy to discuss with you any of these things.
Many thanks, Pedro, for an excellent presentation. I'm sure there are questions either here or online.
Hi, my name is Paolo Cherubini. I'm not working with biodiversity, but I'm working with tree rings. And I was wondering, and wood, and I was wondering, do you have, certainly you have, pollen analysis or charcoal, the soil, you can use to reconstruct past natural vegetation?
Yes, there are several studies I didn't bring here that they bring information about. First, there was grasses several years ago. Originally, there were more shrubs, probably in the late. This is what I remember, but I have to check the paper again. But we have there are some information. At some point, what it says it was a long history of grazing until humans appear in South America, and so the big herbivores go down and then increase the abundance of grasses, and fire starts to play a role in the dynamic of the dragon. But I have to check if we have information of a specific composition change in the last million years. What are you?
No, I was thinking more in the past 10,000 years, or well, I'm sure also you showed fires, and I guess there were also wildfires.
Yeah.
And so probably you would have shrub or herbs, charcoal in the soil at different layers. And so would be very interesting to date them and to reconstruct past vegetation.
Yeah, yes, I believe this is a very good question, and I probably have to back to the paper to read what is done on that. And Yes, I know a couple of papers in Uruguay by sure, but I don't remember the name of the authors in Argentina, but I look on it. If I can send you.
Yeah, thank you.
And if you want to go there to.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that presentation and sort of the history of how you learned about the pampas. And I was sort of intrigued by the nutrient graph with the homogenization and how this somehow in the native and invasive, though you began in different points, you ended with the same point, if you will.
What?
Somehow. You ended with the same pattern in the native versus the invasive grasslands in terms of the homogenization. It was back a few. So I was, no, one more, two more. Oh, I can't, sorry.
You what? No.
No. They were lines that were different colors. But anyway,
Okay.
I guess the question is, so that was mostly a species-based approach. Was this also, did you look at this like from a phylogenetic or a trait-based approach and sort of identify which traits are sort of associated with this homogenization? And are they the same traits in these two sort of different systems where you have the homogenized system from native versus invasive systems?
If
Sorry.
no,
I have
we just start working, but we have some approach. I didn't bring any figure of that, a functional approach. I have one. Sorry for the speed. This is no. Where is it? Here is one. So this is a book chapter that shows one type of grasslands. Those are remnant grasslands, and those are successional grasslands. If you make a species-based approach, you have quite different organization of communities. And if you do a functional group, no functional traits. So I'm not using traits in this. There is more similar. I don't know if the question goes on that direction of the response to nutrients.
Yeah, I get it goes in that direction, but then I guess what you showed also was this response to nutrients. And does this response also go in the same direction in terms of the traits?
Yeah.
So it's a related.
Because
you didn't show us this. So I was thinking more, as things homogenize, regardless of the system, do they homogenize in the same way in trait space? Because presumably the species homogenize, it's different species in the two systems, but maybe it's the same traits and the same sort of changes in traits, sort of responding in the same way with the nutrient addition.
Yeah, I don't. There is one student that did that with grazing and nutrient. Two students, one just focusing on one species, and the other student focused on community. And I don't remember the results, but I think there was but was based on grazing, not in nutrient. So it was a homogenization in trait space too. And inside that we have I can browse for the figure. I know they're in the computer. When you have the exotic species that is tolfecue that dominate the ungrazed area, is more plastic responding traits than some of the natives. So the natives are less plastic than tolfecue in this point. So it's respond more to mowing. So the same treatments. So we use mowing and levels of fertilization, and tolfecue was very, very plastic responding to the in-trait space. I can show you the figures of that.
We have one more question here, maybe others, but then we switch also quickly to the online people.
I just have one question connected to this slide also. As I understood you, these exotic invasive species are mostly accidental introductions. I mean,
mostly forage species.
Yes, but I mean, it was kind of accident that they got there and spread. But my question is, connected to these exotic grasses, is that actively promoted by cattle breeder? Because probably these exotic grasses are C3 grasses, which are better food for the cattle. And in many places, they do that at the cost of native grasses, which probably in the warmer areas are C4 grasses.
Yeah.
So it's not an accident, it's kind of management.
It's a mix of two things. Yes, it's management and an accident. So one of the first, all the research, all our research and one of the research was started with Lolium multiflorum. So this is the exotic. Lolium is an annual grass that came with probably with wheat at the very beginning when they bring wheat species. So that was an accident. But then you have fescue that was not an accident. Fescue was introduced in the 50s with a program to improve forage production in the system. Also sorghum. Sorghum is the Johnson grass. Or cinnamon that was introduced. Cinnamon no, but yes, sorghum was introduced as a forage species. And this change in the grading. So we have in Argentina, we have more C3 invaders, and in Uruguay and Brazil, they have more C4 invaders. But Brazil, Uruguay has much less invasive species than we have. Probably, I don't know, but probably a biogeographic, apart from the grass species introduced for forest production, the dynamic of ships and was different between Buenos Aires. It was the port of South America and was much similar to Europe at some point. In ecologically, I mean, talking.
We move to the online questions. We have two. You can read. I don't.
Okay, we have one question here. The pattern of flooding frequency and salinity as drivers of compositional change in Pampean grasslands seems to be mostly based on samplings done in areas that have soils of low agricultural quality. To what extent do you think these drivers explain the composition of wheat communities in areas which are most intensively cultivated with annual crops?
Yes, good. Probably is one of the first paper of the institute. I work with an institute like that started in the 60s with Soriano, and 3 students work on crops and grassland. And one of the first papers of the institute at some point was studying the wheat communities in maize and in crop system. So I don't have current information on the composition of wheat communities in this grassland because we don't have information yet because they changed just recently. But there are some papers that show that wheat community and insect community changes in different positions in the Rolling Pampa, that is in this region, no, here. So this is where we have information on cropping systems and wheat communities in annual crops. And now annual crops start to be here at some point, and we don't have information yet. So here they have some ideas of some wheat communities indicate higher productive systems, higher productive maize but that was in the 60s. I can search for those papers now. That is from a group that work with us.
Let's come back to a question here.
Sorry, one not so clear.
Thank you. Thank you for this very nice overview of the Pampas. And it's my impression as someone from the Brazilian savanna, the Cerrado, that we talk much less about grass than we talk about forests. So it feels to me that there's an unrecognizable value of the grassland environments. For example, we as a scientific community talk much more about reforestation and deforestation than we talk about getting to know and conserving grasslands.
Yeah.
So I wanted to know what your perception about this as being someone coming from the Pampas. It's hard to get funding for conserving this kind of environments, for example.
That's a very good question. It's an idea that we have that, in fact, at some point, I don't remember, it was 2020 or 10, there was a paper that they want to plant trees everywhere and to reduce carbon and the atmosphere. And there was a big claim, no, just stop, don't put trees on this grassland system. And like 2 months ago, there was a big special issue on Science about that, about grassland systems. I completely agree with you that our idea of natural system is a forest with birds and a bear, but not the grasslands. And I do not work specifically on conservation, so I don't have to fight for conservation funding. But our colleagues in Alianza del Pastizal or AOS Argentina sometimes struggle to find funding. The point that they go first to the animal and then to the grassland. So the core is the panda, so not the bamboo forest. And that, so in our system happens something like this. It's my perception.
Another question is regarding strategies to recover the cover of native species in grasslands. It is a viable strategy to use controlled fires instead of mowing, or does that drive the composition in a completely different direction?
That's a nice question, and we didn't use it. There are some, not in the flooding Pampa, but in other regions in our group that did use fire to study species. Fire was thought as a driver of species invasion, not a restoration tool at that point in our group in the early 2000s. And I'd be happy to do experiment with fire in our grassland, but we don't have information yet. There are information on Brazil and Uruguay on that, and some group in the south of the Pampas in these grasslands that have information, but they focus more on the invasion of forests than in the recovery of native grasses. But I would like to do experiment with fire.
But may I ask, was that originally a driver of these grasslands, or they were just grasslands because of the flooding and because of the native grazing, or was historically fire part of the system?
In the system?
Yeah.
It was natural fires. I'm not aware. I didn't read that much about Aboriginal behavior on terms of fires, but I think that natural fires and slow grazing load were the last 10,000 or 5,000 years history of the site. Then during the last 500 years, after European settlement, grazing increased and there was a big population, and then probably fire was the question of the professor, that fire frequency goes down. So the importance of fire at the regional level, I cannot give you an answer, a precise answer, but I think that lost importance in the last years.
Do we have some more questions here or online? If not, then I would like to thank you for being here. And Pedro,
thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the presentation. You find him in the MGD something 36 if you look for him.
Yes, I'll be very happy to interact with you, and in the case you have to talk about this and maybe think something new for this grassland.
Many thanks.